Alright, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Quick Lit by John. And today we are going to be looking at literary conflict, or conflict in literature. So, before we continue, we have to first of all define some basic phrases, the first of which is the term conflict. Now, what is conflict? Well, conflict in literature is essentially the struggle between opposing forces. It could be the fight between the main character and his enemy, Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader, Harry Potter versus Voldemort, the humans versus the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. Any form of clash or push in opposite directions of two or more forces is classified as conflict. To make our lives a little bit easier, we have to define a couple of more topics from literature. The first is some basic literature terminology. From now on, we will be referring to the main character of a story as the protagonist. So the protagonist would be Harry Potter in Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, The Hobbit in The Lord of the Rings, etc., etc. And working against the protagonist, we have the antagonist. The antagonist is the character who is in conflict with the main character. He is the character, or she is the character, who is pushing against the wills of the protagonist. He would be Joker to the Batman, Lex Luthor to Superman, or Voldemort to Harry Potter. So, conflict. Now, the first definition that we have to make of conflict is that it can be divided into two categories, essentially: external and internal. Now, when we talk about external conflict, we are discussing conflict that takes place outside of the body. And in its turn, external conflict can be divided into various subcategories. The first type, or the first subcategory of external conflict, is entitled person versus person. Essentially, when two characters in a story are in conflict, physical or verbal or psychological, this would be classified as person versus person. When Peter Pan fights Captain Cook, it's person versus person. When Harry Potter fights Draco Malfoy, it's person versus person. The method of the fight is not important. You could use magic, lightsabers, laser swords, sticks, stones, fists, or words. It's irrelevant. As long as two or more people are essentially fighting or arguing with each other, the term to be used is person versus person conflict. The second category of external conflict is entitled person versus nature. So, person versus nature external conflict is when one or more character are fighting against a natural force, such as a flood, animals, diseases, forces of nature, bad weather, snowstorms, etc. When a character is walking up a steep hill into the storm, this is person versus nature. When a character is fighting wild animals, this is person versus nature. When a character is fighting to get out of a burning building, this is person versus nature. The third category of external conflict is person versus society. Now, in many stories, the protagonist battles against an unfair or unjust culture. The classic example to be used for this would be a film such as V for Vendetta, where one character is fighting for the greater good. So when it seems that there is one character fighting against the world, chances are that we're discussing person versus society. Other examples of external conflict include person versus technology, think Matrix, person versus supernatural, think ghost stories, and person versus fate, think stories where a person is fighting against bad luck. So, the next type of conflict we're going to be looking at is internal conflict. Now, internal conflict takes place inside of the body or the mind. And there is only one type of internal conflict. and that is person versus self. In other words, person versus self is when a character is in an indecisive situation, when a character is struggling to overcome fear, addiction, emotional damage, or some other crippling personal issue. We can say that they are in internal conflict and that that conflict is labeled as person versus self. So, what we're going to do now is we are going to practice. You are going to see a series of pictures. Try and decide what type of conflict is being illustrated in the following pictures. So, let's look at this one. We can see a person sitting on a boat. Obviously, the weather is very cold and there is a flood. Essentially, we are looking at the forces of nature battling against the person. So, probably, this type of conflict is person versus nature. 2. Here we see somebody holding their head, obviously in some kind of pain. Probably they're feeling indecisive or torn about some issue. So probably the most correct form of conflict here would be person versus self. In this picture, we can see two people obviously arguing with each other. They're shouting at each other. Now, assuming that this isn't some kind of internal argument happening inside somebody's head, we could say that what we are looking at here is person versus person, external conflict. 4. Here we see a man standing in front of a judge. Now, this could be a tricky one. If the person is fighting against society as a whole, we would say that it is person versus society because he has been wrongly accused. If, however, this is the result of some wrongdoing on behalf of this man, we could perhaps say that it is person versus person. This photograph has been put here for comedic purposes more than anything else. However, the rules still apply. We see a kangaroo knocking over a woman. Now, assuming that a kangaroo is also a force of nature, we could say that this is external conflict, person versus nature. Here we see an individual protesting by holding a flower against lots of soldiers holding guns. The automatic assumption when a protest is involved is that the conflict is person versus society. A classical picture showing two athletes wrestling. The conflict here is obvious. What we are looking at is person versus person. Now that pictures have been mastered, let's try some texts. So, this is a news story from the Titanic. If she had only proceeded more slowly, if she had only taken the southerly route avoiding the icebergs, if only the watch had had a pair of binoculars. Now, underneath, this is labeled news story about the Titanic, and this automatically points us in the direction of person versus nature. The Titanic and the people on the Titanic versus the iceberg. However, we can see that this is a quote, identified by the quotation marks, and the person is feeling regretful. The narrator is regretful about the course the Titanic took. Thus, we could also say that this is internal conflict, person versus self, in that the narrator is in conflict with themselves with regards to the route that the Titanic took through the ice fields. Charles decided to break all the rules the day he decided to steal that car. He was immediately arrested and sent to jail to await his trial. He should have known better than to mess with the rules. So, what can we say about this? Well, first of all, it's obvious that the protagonist, Charles, has decided to break the rules of society. Breaking the rules of society implies that he is going up against society. Thus, it is person versus society. "I don't care who you talk to," screamed Sarah to West. "I just wish I had never met you." Again, this could be analyzed on two levels. First of all, we can obviously say that this is person versus person, in that Sarah is arguing with West. A second line of conflict, though, can be identified internally within Sarah, in that she wishes that she had never met West, thus implying internal conflict, person versus self as well. After the light in the cave was completely gone, Tom began to stumble through the cave blindly, cutting his hands on what appeared to be sharp rocks. So obviously in this text, the protagonist, Tom, is fighting his way through a cave and cutting his hand on sharp rocks. This automatically points us in the direction of person versus nature, external conflict. Nature being represented by the sharp rocks and the person being Tom. Tom found a dry spot to sit down in the dark and began to feel guilty over an argument he had had earlier in the day with his mother, in which he had said, "I hope I never see you again." Now in this text, which is a continuation from the previous slide, we can see that Tom is feeling guilty about an argument. The focus has moved from the conflict he is having with the cave to his internal conflict he is having about feeling guilty over the argument he had with his mother. Thus, it is internal conflict, person versus self. Tom's mother was upset that he wanted to skip going to college in order to go exploring in all of the world's greatest caves before he turned 30. Tom didn't understand what the big deal was and wanted to run his own life. So here we are seeing that there is the conflict going on between Tom and his mother, in that Tom feels that his mother wants to control his life and Tom wants to run his own life. Thus the conflict, Tom and his mother, person versus person. So we have reached the end of this presentation on literary conflict. I hope you found it helpful and that it will help you further your studies in the areas of literature. Thank you very much for listening.